Greetings, sword friends. Today, let me ask you a question. What makes a fantasy sword design good? Now, I'm not going to bore you with my face in the foreground, even though there's a lot to take in this image here. Suffice to say, I am a sword collector and a video game developer and an enjoyer of fantasy and sci-fi genre. So I have given this subject quite some thoughts over the years. Recently, my review of the 4 new swords sent to me, described as medieval fantasy swords, prompt some lively discussion. So I'm happy to opine on the subject. Let's talk about it while looking at some fantasy art inspired by the cutting practices my wife and I did at various beaches, using one of our favorite functional fantasy swords made by Valiant Armory. I will argue that a good fantasy sword, first of all, needs to be a functional sword. Functional in the sense that it conforms with various usage in the history of reality, with techniques reconstructed from martial arts, treatises, manuals, illustrations in manuscripts, traits recorded from in-person observations and handling of authentic original swords at museums or private collections with detailed statistics, practice of weapon-based martial arts, often in lineages inherited from history, such as sparring, tournament competitions, test cutting. This relies on proper hilt designs with ergonomic geometries and the correct mass distribution on the blade that makes a sword essentially an extension of the user's arm, with some variation of purposes, whether it is built for war, especially warfare involving a lot of armored fighting, or scenarios that demand more nimbleness, essentially requiring the sword to be as precise as the surgeon's scalpel, but extend the fighter's reach by 3 feet or 4. One sure bet to make your fantasy sword design believable, therefore enhancing the overall immersion of the world building, is taking strictly historical swords, essentially prominent surviving examples from museums or private collections, such as the protagonist's sword from the fantasy action flick Seventh Son, which is an exact copy of the Schloss Erbach longsword, once in the possession of renowned sword collector and author Jörg Oakeshott of the Oakeshott typology fame. There are tried and true creations, hailing from a time when the maneuverability of a sword decided matters such as life and death. There is never anything wrong with simply taking a historical example in your work, except maybe this approach lacks a little bit originality and novelty when fantasy is concerned. Although you can always pick fancier ones from history, and who can dictate that you cannot fantasize about owning prominent historical swords? This approach has been employed by all sorts of fantasy arts, even illustrations in illuminated Bible manuscripts from medieval times, where events taking place in biblical times were often depicted as characters holding contemporary weapons from the time the art was created. Basically, Bronze Age or even Stone Age people holding strictly medieval swords, but achieving impossible feats, such as cutting a fully armored person in half with a blade. The second approach for good fantasy sword designs is to employ a historically plausible design. Even in history, this has been a common practice. One of the most eminent examples would be the Brescia Spadona, a longsword created in the mid-15th century, consisting of a blade forged in Passau, Germany, and the hilt made in Brescia, Italy. A beautiful specimen serving as an example of the pinnacle of late medieval sword making. In the Middle Ages, this kind of sword was called a bastard sword in French, meaning a sword assembled from components in styles of different geographic or ethnic origins. There is no shortage of examples of sword blades forged in earlier centuries, passed down and then rehilted in styles of a later fashion, especially during the early Renaissance. Today, revered sword makers are still repeating the same practice of designing and manufacturing swords made of blades from one prominent example in history and hilts from another known specimen. Probably the most famous example is the Albion Principe, a bastard sword in more than one way, designed by historical sword recreationist Peter Johnson, who was also invited by HBO production to create stage swords for the Game of Thrones prequel show, House of the Dragon, which was praised universally for its depiction of realism, both in storytelling, but also costume and weapon designs. Having taken components from known antique originals, the Principe ends up being a product that cuts and thrusts exceedingly well, and becoming a staple of historical European martial art cutting competitions. Specifically, the Valiant Armory long leaf-bladed sword and a number of other fantasy sword models of theirs incorporating leaf blades that were prevalent throughout Europe in the Bronze Age, but have faded into obscurity since the transition into the Iron Age. Take these leaf blades and marry them to a hilt that is reminiscent to late medieval longsword hilts that feature a official pommel albeit sporting an unusual geometry, or a ring pommel taken from an Irish sword, an upwardly curved crossguard, and the grip with wasted geometry and turquoise-colored leather wrapping. You got the perfect functional fantasy sword, and it is one of our favorites, being an exemplar of the principle of combining components from different time periods and cultures to create a sword that is original on its own. Due to the attention to detail over the cross-section and the distal taper of the thickness along the unconventional blade shape, it turns out to be a very maneuverable sword that fits medieval European swordsmanship techniques to a T. Another example of this design philosophy will be my friend Nick's Master Sword custom commission, which incorporates a blade inspired by the Roman gladius but elongated, hilt components inspired by the designs in the video game Legend of Zelda, and proportions that take cue from late medieval hand-and-half swords. Combined together, you have a very functional and practical fantasy sword. Now, a simpler solution is simply expanding the dimensions of existing known historical sword examples. Now, one example is the Atlantean sword from Conan the Barbarian. The blade on the Atlantean sword designed by Jody Sampson is simply a broadened version of this sword over here, and this itself is an bastard sword, combining one example of earlier medieval swords, high medieval sword blade found in the Wallace collection, and the hilt that is found in one of the French medieval art with a floral pattern wheel pommel. Now, Jody Sampson's Atlantean sword is simply a blade that's about 50% broader than this sword over here, which makes the blade exceedingly broad. It doesn't taper a lot in the width as it travels across the entire length towards the tip. Obviously, that will make the blade a lot heavier, right? But following this historical design, it has a hollow ground geometry, starting from the edge of the fuller to the edge of the blade. That reduces a lot of weight, not to mention it follows the historical norm of distal tapering of the thickness. So the Atlantean blade moves like a real sword due to the mass distribution. However, it is a lot heavier than a regular sword because of the exaggerated width to make it stand out like a hero sword in the Conan's universe. And to compensate that, a much heavier blade than a regular arming sword, you also have to make the hilt larger, right? Now it has a two-handed grip to accommodate such a imposing and hefty blade. But then all the fittings, the guard, the pommel, they are made of bronze, they are huge, carries a lot of weight to counterbalance the blade. So due to this design of exaggerated proportions, the Atlantean blade is still wieldable. It moves like a real sword, albeit heavier. Right? Another example of this done better is Brother Nathaniel's The Harvester, which is a custom commission of fantasy design of his own. Well, he took inspiration from Conan the Barbarian's universe and the Warhammer 40k fantasy universe, created a blade that carries the same mass distribution as a regular medieval longsword, only is broader and thicker, right? Other than that, it moves exactly the same way as a medieval longsword of the same size. However, it is indeed heavier. As you can see here, a regular user, attuned with medieval longsword fighting techniques, will be able to move it without any problem, but it tires you out more often. So in order for this kind of sword to exist, you have to have some kind of justification in the lore, right? Being that the sword made of lighter metals, or the gravity works a little bit differently on that planet than the Earth. However, you do have to recognize that physics in general work in the same way. They obey the same principle. Therefore, you cannot make very tip-heavy sword and still expect it to move like a sword, right? Rather than a battle axe. In that case, you might as well just throw away your ill-designed fantasy sword and pick up a battle axe. One classic example of the lore done right is the explanation of the notorious blade lengths of Sephiroth's Nodachi Masamune. In later entries of the franchise that serve as the sequels of the main entry of Final Fantasy VII, it is explicitly shown the path to acquisition of the sword by Sephiroth, and how the sword, originally in average size, grew in blade length to adapt to the new user's stature and techniques. No pun intended. How convenient! The sword was forged with cursed magic. Meanwhile, in the real world, Nodachi of prolonged blade lengths existed extensively, and schools of swordsmanship techniques were developed specifically to take advantage of the size of these elongated swords to still retain regular katana's benefit of quick drawing, yet also utilizing the massive reach superiority to dominate the opponents. You might ask how effective these quick draw maneuvers are with shinken, live-edged blades. Here we can see that there's no problem to quick draw a Nodachi of 3 shaku blade lengths, just over a meter long in the blade alone, to form an effective parry or attack within 1 tempo, given the stature of the wielder is considerable. Another alternative route is to take an existing type of historical sword and embellish the fittings or furniture, often on the hilt and scabbard, but could also be engraving, inlay, or in the form of relief sculpture even on the blade. History has not seen a lack of examples that turn swords into elaborate man jewelries for individuals with wealth and status. My friend brother Nathaniel has also designed numerous bespoke swords to be custom-made for his fantasy novel and world building. You can find a number of reviews I have done on these swords sent my way. There is no shortage of alien-looking swords and weaponry specifically from the Indian subcontinent and Africa. One can take inspirations from these specimens, either combine them with other more conventional weapons, or embellish the components to make them stand out further. Personally, to me, better designs and more believable depictions always incorporate a healthy level of understanding of the martial arts associated with said arms and armor, which always calls for extensive observations of actual practitioners, sparring, competitions, form training, and test cutting to learn about the anatomy and biomechanics involved. So the illustrations and choreography wouldn't make silly mistakes, such as holding a sword completely wrong, like a gorilla holding a club, rather than a trained swordsman positioning himself in various guard stances. Of course, sometimes the circumstances or settings in a fantasy work call for larger-than-life examples. Enthusiasts throughout history, such as Henry VIII of England, have toyed with these creations for collection and tournament fighting purposes. Today, people are still passionate about these proof-of-concept weapons, so obviously there is a wealth of examples that have been proven functional to a certain extent, as they serve as more extreme and novel versions of existing weapon types. Incorporating them into your fantasy will probably make the unique character or setting stand out, so that's not a bad idea. I'm also obligated to point out the exception that in some ultra-stylish fantasy depictions, there is an implicit and mutual understanding between the audience and creators that certain unrealistic elements of weapon designs can be forgiven if the viewer can take a leap of faith to immerse themselves in the consistent absurdity of the style if it serves a point. Example, in the Warcraft universe, swords with exaggerated proportions and overtly spiky hilt designs are not only tolerated but appreciated when human anatomy and architecture are seen in similarly hyperbolic scales. For example, biceps as thick as the torso itself, and forearms thicker than the thighs. I think most people are able to entertain hyperbole when it's explicit. Of course, when such stylized universes are adapted into live action, adjustments have to be made to bring forth believability while still retaining the source material's aesthetics. Counterexamples of this producing fantasy designs brought to life gone wrong would be hilt components lacking any thought of ergonomics or an iota of understanding of how these swords should be used end up eventually hurting the users, or the lack of regard for proper mass distribution on the blade that stems from the nuance of cross-section, profile and distal taper of the breadth and thickness, making the supposed sword feel like a crowbar instead. These are obvious instances that a good fantasy artist or production set should take steps to avoid. So I hope this has been thought-provoking. If you have any questions or comments, put them in the comment section down below. I highly appreciate that. Find any value or entertainment, please like and subscribe.